to the Cover 3 podcast here on CBS Sports. That's Danny Cannell, that's Bud Elliott, that's Tom Fernelli. I'm Chip Patterson coming to you live on CBS Sports Network. Fired up to be with you over the next hour. A ton to get into. The AP Top 25 poll will be released in moments. We will be giving you the update where Big Ten teams stand and some of the big movements from within the new rankings. We also have huge games in the Big Ten on deck. Michigan playing host to Texas in the Big House, and Matt Rule and Nebraska squaring off with Colorado once again. We're going to give you that big game breakdown treatment. But let's begin with those Trojans, because on Sunday night, USC, who we now know has moved up 10 spots from number 23 to number 13 in the new AP Top 25 poll, made quite a statement. And so, Danny, I guess what impressed you the most in terms of what you saw from USC, the way that it all played out in that win against LSU?
The answer to the unknown was the defense. The defense was what we weren't sure about. Like, we trusted Lincoln Riley to figure out his quarterback, to be able to put up points offensively. So it was no surprise there. The defensive game plan by Danton Lynn, the defensive coordinator, combined with this new look defense, which looks like it has some dudes, combined with outstanding tackling, was something we did not know we were going to get. And that's why I love the fact that the AP voters said, you know what? We're not going to just bump them up a few spots. We're going to move them all the way up, because now all of a sudden this team, I do think, gets into that upper tier category of the Big Ten. So I am bullish on USC now. From what we saw, a lot of those questions were answered in that game against LSU, which was a really good challenge for them, and they lived up to it.
Denny, I was also pretty impressed with USC's offense, how the drop-off from Caleb Williams was a bit minimized. And to me, it looked like they were running an offense that was more similar to what Lincoln ran before he had Caleb Williams. And obviously, if you have Caleb Williams, you're going to let Caleb Williams go out and ball out. And obviously, Caleb had to chase points like crazy. I mean, like USC last year knew they had to score 40 and 50. So it was hero ball every single drive. But this looked a little bit more like it was in structure, like Lincoln Riley was scheming things up. If you're a USC fan, I think you have to be really excited that this offense is still going to score a heck of a lot of points.
Yeah, what I saw was a Lincoln Riley Oklahoma team, but actually wearing USC uniforms. Like, Danny, you're right. The defense was the biggest question mark of this team coming into the season. They made those changes on that side of the ball at pretty much every single position on the coaching staff. And as I was saying all off season, like, I had faith that the offense was going to be fine because it's a Lincoln Riley team. But the defense didn't have to be great. The defense just had to be kind of average. And I think that what we saw in that game was a USC defense that, yes, it gave up yardage. It was giving up plays. But once they got into the red zone, as Bud likes to call it, they were playing that red zone roulette and just trying to take their chances and limit teams to kicking field goals. And I thought that they did an outstanding job of that against LSU, keeping players in front of them, making tackles. Oh, my God, actually practicing how to tackle actually helps in real games. Who could have seen that coming? And then you're right, but on the offensive side of the ball, it did look like a more structured kind of game plan. And last year, with them having to chase points so often and just having the playmaker and Caleb Williams, they did kind of play some backyard football times and just hope Caleb could do something incredible. And a lot of times he did. But Miller Moss, to me, like, we saw him in that bowl game last season. He threw for 6 touchdowns in the game. He looked incredible against Louisville. I still had some question marks about what he was going to look like this season now that it was his job. But what really impressed me most of all was, if you look at the overall stat line, it wasn't, eye-popping, incredible stuff. But in the key moments, on key plays and in key drives, he just looked so calm, cool, and collected, just making the plays that were there, not getting crazy, not trying to do too much, taking what the LSU defense was giving him, and the LSU defense was happy to give him quite a bit, and he took advantage, moved them down the field, got them in position to win the game, and I just thought overall, from top to bottom, that was one of the best USC games I've seen in about 2 years.
Hey, he's such a new face to the way we talk about USC football. Now, I forgot, he's redshirt junior. Guy's been there a minute. He's been able to develop, certainly showed up big time on that big stage. Okay, Tom, before we get to ranking the top of the Big Ten, or more specific, ranking the top 5 in the Big Ten as it stands right now with an overreaction after just 1 week, have you raised what you think USC can accomplish this season? Is USC a playoff contender, a Big Ten title contender, a national championship contender? How are you moving your floor and your ceiling? What can the Trojans do if they were able to play their best football the rest of the regular season?
They have to keep playing like they played on Sunday night against LSU. I have raised my estimation for them overall. I'm not quite ready to bump them up to like a national title contender, but I do think that this is a team that, based off of what we saw in the Big Ten in week 0 and week 1, I feel like USC has to be in the conversation now of teams who can get to Indianapolis and play in the Big Ten championship. If the team that we saw this weekend shows up, the offense continues to play well and take care of the football, and the defense just does a solid enough job of limiting points for the opponent, this is a team that's going to win a lot of the games that are on its schedule. Because when you looked at their schedule coming in, obviously there was the opener against LSU, there's the finisher against Notre Dame, and then there's the Michigan game and the Penn State game during the regular season. Those were the games that you decided were going to settle their season, how well they did in them. Well, they're already off to a 1-0 start in those 4 key games. So I think you have to raise your estimation of what this team's capable of.
Tom, I agree with you for sure. And like, I think at best, we all had that game as a coin flip on Sunday night. So you add basically another half win to their win column projection. You see their schedule on the screen here. I think the key is that they're going to be playing much tougher defenses than LSU. Like, yes, USC's offense looked it was competent, it was composed, but also LSU played a pretty good amount of poor defense in that game. They will play Michigan, they'll play Penn State, they'll play Notre Dame. Those 3, I'm very confident, are better defenses than LSU is. They will also face Nebraska. They'll face Wisconsin. Minnesota's defense is not that poor. Like, Rutgers and Maryland play a little bit of defense. Granted, they can't score, so that may actually help out USC. But how good will this offense be week to week? Like, if you still had Caleb on this team, this is why I think a lot of USC fans were so mad about last year. If you had this defense with Caleb on a team, then that's a really special team. How will this team play week to week against a really good set of defenses they have to face?
I'm a little bit more bullish. I think Miller Moss was not a fluke, and I do think Lincoln Riley figures out his quarterback skill set. And like you mentioned, I thought he played way more in the system, which might overall be better. It also was the first time it really felt like you had a lot of athletes on the field. Zachariah Branch comes to mind. The catch was insane from Kyron Hudson. You had dudes all over the field that look like they can fly, like look like they can make plays. And it felt like a little bit too centric around Caleb Williams lifting everybody else. Now you got more of a game manager, and I don't mean that in a derogatory term. I think it's perfect, and I think he can excel, and I think he outplayed Garrett Nussmeier. But I'm also like, so they're going to go against better defenses and better teams, but I think this offense will figure out a way to put up points against them. So I put them, I don't know if I'm willing to go all the way with Ohio State and Oregon and maybe even Penn State, but I feel better about them than I do against Michigan. And we'll get to see them play in the big house. And I don't want to overreact, but I think USC is a very real player in the Big Ten.
No, we overreact. It's one of the great things we do during week 1. We want to overreact. Okay, so here's the pitch. It is right now. If they lined up tomorrow, if you were to power rank this thing based on what we just saw, and maybe you do want to be a little bit more measured and not overreact. So the assignment is the top 5 teams in the Big Ten ranked. Danny, let's hear your 5. Get us rolling.
So I'm not moving off of Ohio State, right? That'd be crazy because, they look the part. They've got the best roster out there. So I'm sticking them at number 1 still. Even with the Oregon Ducks, I think I'm trying to get my graphic up there to see if I can get some help there. So I did go Penn State over Oregon. Oregon's performance was a little bit concerning. Where we stand right now, I thought Penn State's offense looked the part. Andy Koltnicki comes in there. They wanted explosive firepower. They got it. And this is where I did bump USC over Michigan into that 4 spot because of what we saw out of both teams, right? We're raving about USC, also very concerned about the offensive line at Michigan, the absence of Donovan Edwards in the run game, and the concern at quarterback playing, trying to figure out still who's their guy with Texas coming to town. A little bit more concerned about Michigan. So that's how I have the top 5 shaping out.
Danny, we actually have the exact same top 5 here. It's a little tighter between certain tiers. Like I have Ohio State gap, then sort of Oregon, Penn State, pretty close gap, then USC, Michigan. Like, I definitely could see the case for Michigan being over USC, but to me, the way that Michigan went about its offseason with how it attacked the transfer portal, all the things you heard out of there, it seemed like they were going to be a lot of 11-man run game. spread option with Alex Orji. They did not bring in a transfer at receiver to really give them a receiver that might scare any decent defense in the Big Ten, which apparently they lack, given what we saw against Fresno. And I just don't think it's congruent with their offseason build that they went with Davis Warren, who's not a runner, instead of Alex Orji. So I did bump Michigan down a little bit, but I mean, that defense will keep them in basically every single game with everybody they play.
I am a rock. I am not going to overreact to anything I saw in week 1. I still have Ohio State at 1. I still have Oregon at 2. Yeah, that game against Idaho was ugly, but they weren't really trying to look pretty. It was just get out of here and get the win and move on for the rest of the season. The only change I made, I moved Penn State up from 4 to 3 above Michigan just because I was so encouraged by what I saw from the Penn State offense in that West Virginia game. I do think that's real. I don't think that's a fluke. I've loved Andy Kotelnicki for a few years now, and he's immediately paying dividends in Happy Valley. When it comes to the Michigan-USC situation, I'm keeping the Trojans below the Wolverines simply because I never had the Trojans in the top tier of the league to begin with. I was comparing them more to Iowa and Nebraska and those teams. Now I'm pretty clear. I feel like USC is better than those teams, and they're the top of that tier. But when I compare them to Michigan, I'm looking at the Michigan offense, defense, and USC's offense and defense. By far, the best of those 4 units is Michigan's defense. Yes, USC's defense looked solid against LSU. I'm still not going to take one game against them and say, oh, that's a great defense now. That's a team that could still have some bad weeks. I know that no matter what, Michigan's defense will be elite, and maybe that offense can improve. So I'm keeping the Wolverines over the Trojans.
Okay, so I agree, Ohio State. And also, Bud, to your point, I do think it is Ohio State line where I might have thought that Oregon was on that top tier. I'm going to push him down. And what I've got Penn State as my number 2, Oregon at my number 3. It is much more about the positives for the Nittany Lions than it is the negatives for Oregon, or the fact that you weren't able to put a 70 or an 80 on the scoreboard like you had done in previous years with Dan Lanning against FCS opponents. I just think that Penn State's offense was clicking at such a high level. It was impressive. You did it on the road. You did it against a team that I don't think is overly talented in West Virginia, but certainly well coached and did a great job last year of coming up on the positive end of coin flip games. And you just put them at arm's distance, and you held them at arm's distance throughout the entire afternoon, through a weather delay even. So I've got Penn State as my 2. Again, this is about positivity for the Nittany Lions more than downgrading Oregon, because with that Nittany Lions defense, there was always room to be able to improve if you found something offensively. Rounding it out, yeah, I'm going to overreact just a little bit. I've got USC as my 4, Michigan as my 5. I think I'm going to hold that until we get to see a little bit more from that Michigan offense. Let's take a look at everybody's answers all lined up. You can see Tom is the only rock among us. The rest of us are ready to jump USC from the middle of the Big Ten all the way into the top 4. Ohio State remains the king, and Penn State with a strong impression in their win at West Virginia. Well, this is just how we rank the teams at the top of the Big Ten. What about the teams in the Big Ten and where they rank in the new AP Top 25 poll? It was just released, and we'll let you know next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. The new AP Top 25 poll was just released, and here's the way the top 10 looks. Georgia and Ohio State hold their position. Oregon takes a 4-spot tumble to number 7. That allows for some upward movement for Texas, Alabama. Notre Dame jumping ahead in line over Ole Miss to get up to number 5. Penn State holding tight at number 8. Missouri is up, and Michigan down 1 spot. Florida State Seminoles dropping all the way out of the rankings. USC up to number 13, up 10 spots, as we mentioned earlier. And then Iowa down at number 21. Clemson holds on. NC State holds on. Other action down at the bottom includes Texas A&M falling out along with the Seminoles. So as we look at the new AP Top 25 and we're starting to pick this thing apart, Tom, do you think that Michigan and Oregon dropping ever so slightly was a fair or a reaction that you could predict?
I think it was an easily predictable action because if you watched Oregon again, they played Idaho, which is a team I think they were favored to beat by 75 points, and they only ended up beating them by 10. It was a 3-point game in the fourth quarter. So for a majority of voters who probably didn't spend a whole lot of time watching the game, just looking at the box score, you're thinking, oh my God, this team played terrible. And in truth, they were missing some starters on the offensive line, and they really weren't trying too hard to show anything. But I get it. The drop to 4 spots when you struggle against an FCS team compared to the teams that they bumped ahead of them, who all looked fantastic, makes plenty of sense. I think the Michigan one also makes sense, but I am a little surprised by it because Michigan did win by 20 points. It's not like they were stuck in a close game. They put it away against Fresno State, a Fresno State team that might prove to be one of the better teams in the Mountain West. So I do think it's a little silly to bump Missouri up for crushing an FCS team and move Michigan down for winning by 20.
But do you feel like Iowa got bonus points with their 4-spot jump because they had as many touchdown receptions from a wide receiver in this single game as they did in all of last season? Is it the Iowa offensive renaissance that is just totally blowing everyone's mind right now? What were some of the things that stood out to you just throughout the entire top 25?
Yeah, Chip, I think if you want to argue for a Big Ten team in here, I would probably look at Nebraska. Nebraska played a UTEP team, which is not good, but not terrible. That they won and covered rather easily. NC State, another team that I think is kind of a similar level team to Nebraska. They struggled with their FCS opponent and looked pretty terrible, actually. So if we care about these Week 1 results, I think you got to have Nebraska over NC State. They both have big time prove it games this weekend, however, with NC State hosting Tennessee, and as we'll talk about later on in the show, Colorado heads to Nebraska.
Danny, we like to take a little bit of a Big Ten focus, but we are also humans. We also have emotions here. And look, on one hand, right, you've always advocated for, being able to make sure that all the conferences are represented. We appreciate that. And you've got Louisville, and you've got Georgia Tech, and you've got NC State. You've got Clemson. I mean, you're holding down 22 through 25 in the poll, but Florida State falls all the way out. Vibe check here. Where are we at with the Noles? Was this a fair reaction? And how does Florida State move forward after Monday night's disappointing loss?
We're definitely all human around here. Some of the bullying that's taking place and some members of this show feels inhumane. Now I'm just going to put that out there first. It is a rough start for Florida State to start the season. That is putting it mildly. And the thing that's probably most alarming is that a team that was projected to potentially, they were the favorite coming in to win the ACC, all of a sudden with this 0-2 start and issues on the defensive side of the ball, on the offensive line, clearly with the quarterback, all of a sudden you're starting going down the schedule saying, all right, is this team making a bowl? Which clearly I think is a little bit of an overreaction, but they have so far to go to build up confidence in their fan base, in their players, in that locker room, that I think it's actually a discussion that is not that crazy to have. The thing for me that probably is the most surprising is clearly the defense is not living up to the hype. The offensive line isn't living there, but I think the situation that you have unfolding is Mike Norvell thought he could give DJ Uiagalelei the best situation that he's had in his career. Instead, it might be the worst situation he's found himself in because he doesn't have a run game. He doesn't have a defense. And as we saw last night, when he's put too much of the workload on his shoulders, he's just too inaccurate at this point in his career to carry the team. They have got to figure out a way to put better pieces around him, to have players make catches, or else it is going to be a really long season for the Noles.
But final word here. So what is the path forward? Like what what's there. It's all been laid out. What if you're Mike Norvell, how do you spend this off week trying to better position yourself so that you aren't going into those last games in November sweating your postseason eligibility?
I don't know if you can. Honestly, I think Norvell's got to figure out during the bye week, like who wants to play, who wants to be serious about it, who cares about winning and losing ball games, as opposed to just being in school and enjoying a lot of the perks that come with it. And they are still technically in the ACC race mathematically. I think you play for that until you're out, and once you're out of that, I think you go youth movement, right? DJU, thanks for coming in. You're not a pro prospect. Brock Glenn, you're in the lineup now, right? This is Florida State. Like you're not bowl or no bowl. I don't think fans really care. 6-7 or 6-6, 7-5, 5-7 to them. I think it's the same. It's a failure, right? So you need to start progressing as to what can come next. So once they're at an ACC title race, I think they go youth movement, or at least should.
Lot to look ahead to, a lot to fix in the off week for Florida State. New AP Top 25 is out right now. You can check out the full 1 through 25 over at CBSSports.com. All right, no time to linger in the past and the rankings. We got to look ahead. So coming up on the other side, the first of our 2 big game breakdowns here on our CBS Sports Network Hour, inside the matchup. Texas's big visit to Ann Arbor to take on Michigan. All that and more next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. One of the things we like to do, both here on this show and on the Cover 3 podcast, which you can download wherever you get your podcasts, is to not just give you picks like we do in our Locks episode on Thursday, but to really take you inside the matchup, the X factors, the storylines, the places where the game will be decided. And one of the biggest games of the whole non-conference schedule in the whole country is Texas, now an SEC member, coming off of its college football playoff appearance, going to play Michigan, the reigning national champions. Danny, why don't you get us started? When you start to break this matchup down, where do your eyes go in terms of some of your biggest questions or the things you think are the most important?
The most important position of the game, it's QB. And there is a significant edge to the Texas Longhorns, clearly with, Quinn Ewers and Arch Manning, if you want to throw him in there too, in case anything would happen there at the quarterback position. But I am a believer in the old cliche, if you have 2 quarterbacks, you have none. And I know that Davis Warren was a great story and he lit him up in the spring, but I don't like how they're trying to figure out which ones are coming, and they have this package that's probably a little bit too big for Alex Orji. When I say too big, they're utilizing him too much, where it's really hard for Davis Warren to get any sort of the rhythm going when you're having to shuttle out is so frequently for Alex Orji to come in. They've got to figure this thing out in a hurry. Neither one had a real good feel for the receivers. It was Colston Loveland, who is one of the better tight ends out there, as the favorite target, the leading receiver, but they've got to figure out the quarterback, find one guy. If it is Davis Warren, give him a chance. I get maybe a goal line package for Alex Orji. We did see him score in that game, but out in the field, third downs, whatever critical situations are out there, I think they've got to find one and stick with them and figure out their identity of what they want to be.
Danny, you mentioned the quarterback. Obviously, it's very important. I'm very curious, how does Michigan cover the Texas wide receivers? Texas has a rebuilt receiver room this year. It's a lot smaller. It's a lot quicker than it was last year. Michigan still has Will Johnson. They still have some nice pieces in the secondary, but they also have a lot of turnover in that secondary. If it's me, I'm not trying to run the ball at Michigan. Michigan's front 7 is still dynamite. I'm going to try to spread Michigan out as much as possible and make sure that new corner, make sure that new safety, make sure that new nickel is actually up to the challenge of covering all of that Texas speed. And then it'll be on Quinn Ewers. Can he make those decisions? Can he find the open man? Michigan has a lot of really intricate pressure packages. It's not going to be easy, but Michigan's corners have got to be able to hold up against all that Texas speed.
Yeah, I think this game's going to be decided in the lines of scrimmage. We talked about it on the show last week. I agree. Michigan's quarterback situation against Fresno State was a mess. Like, it was not pretty. There was not a lot to sit there to watch and be like, oh, I feel good about that. But to me, the bigger concern was how terrible Michigan's offensive line looked against a Fresno State team that, granted, might have one of the better defensive lines in the Mountain West, but it's still a Mountain West team, and you're still much bigger than they are. So the fact Michigan really wasn't able to get any kind of push, particularly early from its offensive line, either in the run game or to protect in the passing game, is a huge concern. And now comes Texas, who is a little bit better than Fresno State defensively. Like, they lose Byron Murphy and Montez Sweat from the middle of that defense from last season, but they have guys coming in to replace them. It's more of a rotation, at least based on what we saw last week in the Colorado State game. But the problem was, I went and watched the Texas game against Colorado State. They didn't show you anything. Like, they didn't have to do anything. They were pretty much just sitting there rushing 4 guys every single time. There was very low pressure rate. They didn't record a single sack. I didn't know that they were actually trying to record a single sack because the Colorado State offense wasn't be able to do anything anyway. So how will this Michigan offensive line handle this Texas front? Will they be able to open run lanes for the running game? Because this is still Michigan. You know they're going to try to run the ball. It's what they want to do. It's what they've always tried to do. And if they are able to run the ball, then whether it's Davis Warren or Alex Orji, life will become easier for either one of them. On the other side of the ball, you mentioned it, Bud, Texas probably won't be able to run the ball against Michigan. We saw in the Colorado State game, they struggled running the ball against the Rams. They've suffered injuries at the running back spot already coming into the season. And Michigan last week against Fresno State allowed an average of negative 0.16 yards before contact in the run game. They were touching guys in the backfield on average every single snap. Where they looked a little susceptible was through the air. So that is going to be a very interesting situation here because you have Quinn Ewers, you have these Texas receivers. And we saw Michigan, as we kind of suspected all offseason, when Wink Martindale takes over your defense, you're going to blitz a lot. Michigan blitzed nearly 40% of the time against Fresno State. What are they going to try to do against Quinn Ewers in this Texas offense, which is one of the few teams in the country I look at on the offensive line and say, they've actually got a chance of blocking Michigan up front. So I do think that that is where the game is going to be decided on both sides for both teams.
All right, Tom, what about that coaching matchup? Because, Sharon Moore, he's there on the sideline. The offense isn't getting going. The cameras are just going to love it because he's the new Michigan coach and he's taking over for Jim Harbaugh and they're the reigning champions. It feels like he is going to get a lot of the attention here, but that head coach over there, Steve Sarkisian, he can coach some ball too. So you mentioned the changes that we have. Wink Martindale, new defensive coordinator at Michigan. Texas has a defensive staff that lost Jeff Choate, who's now the head coach at Nevada. When you look at the coaching matchup and sort of the way that they're going to have to pass the chalk here, a game that's got about a touchdown spread, over under right around 45. This is a daggum NFL game on our hands. How do you think the coaching matchup is it going to end up playing out on Saturday?
I give the edge to Texas here. I think, this whole show, we've long argued Steve Sarkisian is one of the better play callers in the country. He's one of the better offensive minds. And you look at what he has to work with. Like, yes, Wink Martindale is an excellent defensive coach. He's had plenty of success in the NFL. His coordinators or his, underlings are the guys that Michigan hired to run their defense the last few years. They're who they learned that defense from. But unlike what, Sharon Moore has on offense, Sark has experience at quarterback. There's nothing Quinn Ewers hasn't seen yet at the college level. So if they know Michigan's going to be ultra aggressive and blitzing a lot, they're going to have a set of plays ready to take advantage of that. And Michigan's going to have to adjust. And we're going to have to see, I think Will Johnson can take away whoever they feel like the best player on that Texas offense is. So you have to find other ways to get them the ball and just try to stay away from Will Johnson, which is typically a good game plan every single week. But I do still think that they're going to have to try to run the ball. So maybe we'll see some screens to kind of slow down that Michigan aggressiveness, and that'll allow them to run the ball more in the second half.
Now, if you want to come get Bud Elliott's lock or pick on this game, come hang out 11 a.m. Eastern time on Thursday for the Cover 3 Locks episode. But as we sit here live on CBS Sports Network on Tuesday, Bud, what's the handicap looking like? Total, team total, first quarter, fourth quarter, the spread straight up? What do you think is a spot that you're starting to look at in terms of the way that this game might play out from a picks perspective?
Sure. So I on numbers, I should bet Michigan, but on matchups, I'm not going to. Right. I think if you just take pure power ratings, you're giving Michigan like normal home field advantage is 2. You're probably giving Michigan like 3.5 here. They're going to be jacked up. They're going to probably be very grabby, very physical, try to drag Texas down to the muck. But like when I look on my sheet where I want to bet Michigan or where I want to fade Michigan, right? It says teams who can block Michigan, bet against Michigan. Teams who can spread Michigan out, bet against Michigan. Everybody else, bet on Michigan. So to me, Texas would kind of check those boxes, but yet I think the number, it's already baked in. I'm not laying over a touchdown here in the big house. So I will have a lot of locks on our locks podcast on Thursday. This probably won't be one of them.
That's why what you're talking about, I do think there's an overreaction to what we see. It's totally normal. It's human to see what you saw based off of one game and say, I'm getting off this team, or to see a line move as much as it has in this game. I kind of like Michigan at home. Chips had one of those matchups, Wink Martindale against Steve Sarkisian. Can he confuse Quinn Ewers? They did get 2 picks against Mikey Keene. Clearly, different level of quarterbacks, one of the best in the country. But I also wonder if they were holding back some schemes somewhat, some blitzes, some looks that could be frustrating for that high-flying Texas offense. Clearly, Michigan wants to slow the game down, so I'd probably lean the under in this one. But I kind of like Michigan over a touchdown at home. We'll have to see, like you said, cover 3 if we lock it up or not.
Yeah, I guarantee you, Wink Martindale has like, how people have cookbooks of 1,000 different recipes. Wink Martindale's got 1,000 different blitzes he could throw at you from any single time, and he loves to do it. I don't know, like as far as the spread in this game, Bud mentioned it. Like I think a lot of that stuff is baked in. It is very difficult for me to look at Michigan as a touchdown underdog at home and not want to take that, but I'm probably going to stay away from it. Honestly, what I like more than anything in this game is the under, because I really don't have a ton of faith in this Michigan offense right now. And I have a lot of faith in the Michigan defense to, at a minimum, minimize damage that Texas will be able to do to them and keep this one low scoring. So if I'm taking anything right now, it's the under.
Again, come hang out 11 a.m. Eastern. Oh, you want me? Quinn Ewers won in Tuscaloosa. What are we doing here? He can win anywhere, but you'll have to come and hang out 11 a.m. Eastern time on Thursday. Coming up on the other side, more big game breakdown. Only this time, we are looking at an old rivalry that's got a new flair. Deion Sanders on one side, Matt Rule on the other. They played early last season. So what can we take away from that? And what do we know about the teams now heading into 2024? It's big game breakdown for Colorado, Nebraska, all that and more next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. It's big game breakdown. And we've got our attention on a huge non-conference matchup in the Big Ten, as Nebraska will be squaring off once again against Colorado. Now, there is a lot that has changed from last year's matchup to this year's matchup, but mostly on the Nebraska side. So, Danny, why don't you get us started with this quarterback matchup? In week one, Shedeur Sanders was able to help the Buffs avoid an upset against North Dakota State. Dylan Raiola kind of poured it on a little bit against UTEP. What did you see from both of these quarterbacks in week one? What are you expecting in this particular matchup?
I think we already knew what we get out of Shedeur Sanders, right? More of what we saw last year was with elite college football quarterback play. I mean, he made great decisions, made big throws, and he's got great weapons to work with. We still saw him running for his life somewhat, getting sacked a few times. So I think we knew what we got there. I was really happy, and so was Matt Rule, and so was every single Nebraska Cornhusker fan with what you saw out of Dylan Raiola. And even mentioned after the game, talking about it wasn't so much the stat line, throwing for a couple hundred yards and having a couple touchdown passes, but the way that he managed the game. I think that's going to be huge, because the bigger the stage, the more the tendency, the temptation is to try to go toe-to-toe with Shedeur Sanders, to try to feel like every drive, I've got to make a huge play and I have to do this. And so you start to force the ball when maybe a punt would be just fine and taking a sack is okay. That, to me, is what I think will be really fascinating to see play out. Also, we saw Colorado's defense struggle against the run. That was one thing. Nebraska did run the ball really well against UTEP. I would expect them to try to do the same so that you don't have your young freshman quarterback in third and longs and in awkward situations where he might make some of those mistakes early. I think that's the best thing that Matt Rule can do for Dylan Raiola, is giving him that run game that he had against UTEP.
It's a pretty fascinating matchup, right? So Colorado, because it doesn't really have a tight end and because it has a lot of really good receivers, they operate almost exclusively out of 4 and 5 wide, and they don't really have much of a run game. I'm fascinated to see just how patient can Nebraska's defense force Shedeur Sanders to be. If I'm defensive coordinator Tony White, he's a guy who's known for having a ton of different looks. He's one of the hardest guys to go against in the country. My number one goal is to deny explosive plays, right? I'm going to dare Colorado to run the football. I'm going to play with a light box. That means, fewer guys in the box against the run game. And I think some of my defensive linemen can win up front against Colorado's offensive linemen and defend the run without really devoting a lot of capital in terms of the number of defenders to defend that run. And then if Colorado does progress the ball down the field, I'm going to try to win in the red zone. When you watch Colorado against North Dakota State, really their only answer in the red zone was to throw the ball to Travis Hunter, which is a pretty damn good answer. However, I do think Nebraska probably has better players to defend that, right? Like, you need multiple answers in the red zone. So I think if you're Nebraska, you deny explosives, you have a pretty good shot to win the game if you come out on the good side of spinning the wheel with that red zone roulette. If Shedeur finds a way to score a lot of touchdowns in the red zone, then Colorado probably wins the game. But can they dare them to run the ball? And if so, can Colorado meet that challenge?
Yeah, going back to last week's Colorado game, it did feel like a lot more of the same of what we saw last year. And it was a close game against North Dakota State. But I think what a lot of people are possibly overlooking is that the North Dakota State that Colorado faced is not the North Dakota State that was winning FCS titles a few years ago. It's not as good of a team as it used to be. So the fact that they were kind of able to hang in and make that a game, to me, is somewhat alarming if I'm a Colorado fan, particularly coming into this game, because when you watched the Buffs last week, the offensive line, which was a huge problem for that team last year, looked better against North Dakota State. But the average weight of the defensive lineman on North Dakota State two deep is 261 pounds. The average weight of the Nebraska defensive line that Colorado's facing this week is 276, and that includes the big 300-pound Nash Hutmacher sitting in the middle. So you're right, bud. If I'm Nebraska, I dare you to run the ball against us because I don't think you can. You couldn't run the ball last week against North Dakota State. So why do I think you're going to be able to do it to me now? The concern that I have if I'm Nebraska going into this game is that watching last week's game against UTEP, like it was a very similar situation to what we discussed with Texas. Nebraska wasn't trying to show you a whole lot. They were sticking to pretty basic and vanilla coverages on defense. But they were a little susceptible. UTEP was able to get some stuff done on them through the air. And UTEP doesn't have nearly the receiver talent that Colorado has. And Colorado will try to spread you out and get you into those situations to where you can make mistakes. And if you make a mistake against a Travis Hunter, you're done. It's going to be a touchdown. So that's going to be key. Nebraska's going to have to figure out a way to keep the big plays in front of them. And on the other side, Dylan Raiola did look excellent in that game, and I want to see how smart and how patient he can be against this Colorado defense because they play a lot of man coverage. In fact, if you look at the stats, they play over 71% of the time last week in man, which was the third highest rate in the country of anybody who played. They seem to think Shiloh Sanders is Ed Reed. They play a lot of man underneath and let Shiloh freelance in the back. The problem with that is Ed Reed's in the Hall of Fame because he's Ed Reed. Most guys are not Ed Reed, and I do not put Shiloh Sanders in the category of Ed Reed. So I expect to see Dylan Raiola and this Nebraska offense take advantage of that, whether it's Isaiah Nayor or if it's the other kid whose name completely escapes my mind right now. I just think that Banks, thank you, Jamal Banks. I think that the Cornhuskers will be able to take advantage of that. I do not think this will be a game like last season, which Nebraska turned the ball over roughly 11 billion times and lost in Boulder. If they take care of the football, I think Nebraska is the better team, and I think they come home with the win here.
I just want to piggyback on what you guys were saying about Nebraska's defense. Totally agree with the game plan, what it should be. This is an offense that likes to get big plays. They like to take shots down the field. Shedeur likes to be aggressive with the football. Light box, as Bud mentioned, when I was at 1995 at Florida State, at Virginia, we ran against them. They rushed 3 and dropped 8 all night. We threw it 67 times, had 456 yards passing, but we lost the game. They didn't give up the big play. I did throw 3 interceptions. I didn't want to drop that one on you guys, but it was like forced, and we kept on it. And Mark Richt, the offensive coordinator, he said his biggest regret after that game was not running the ball more. Make them run the ball because they don't really want to. They want to put it on Shedeur's shoulders. When you look at the box, when you're calling plays, make them run the football. Make them do something they really don't want to do, and you still might be able to stop them running the football with that light box. So totally agree with you guys on what Nebraska should do defensively.
Did y'all have a good running back that year, Danny?
Just a guy named Warwick Dunn who wasn't bad.
Yeah. Yeah, that's okay. All right. Okay. So again, similar to what we said, we've got a Locks podcast on Thursday. Come hang out 11 a.m. Eastern time. But as you're looking at this in terms of the handicap, Danny, what stands out to you as something that you're at least starting to ruminate on here early in the week?
I think this will be a higher scoring affair. I do. I think Nebraska will be able to figure out ways to put points on Colorado's defense. We didn't see much improvement there. And I do think that Colorado, with some of the firepower they showed, with Shedeur calling the shots, with Travis Hunter out there, he had 3 touchdowns last week. He's almost unstoppable, even if you throw it to him in coverage. I think it'll be a higher scoring game. So that's kind of where I'm leaning, is sort of towards a little bit more of a higher scoring affair.
I lean lower scoring because I do think that Nebraska lacks the personnel to cover Colorado. So I think they need to, as we said, devote all those numbers, a lot of short passes, a lot of completions, clock runs. And if I'm Nebraska on offense, I'm taking my sweet time, man. I do not want Shedeur Sanders to have 11, 12, 13 drives. I'd like a nice little sweet spot of like maybe 7 drives for Shedeur, okay? Hitting the receivers, running the ball, taking that clock. Oh, what I got on the helmet radio. Cool. Let me make my adjustments here. low pace game. I tend to think it's a little slower.
Yeah, Bud and I, we are simpatico on this one. I think it'll be lower scoring. And because of that, I also think Colorado will be able to stick around and make this one close. So my leans at this point are on the under and Colorado in the points.
Let's go a little Nebraska team total over. I've seen that Buffs defense against North Dakota State. Dylan Raiola is going to go and light it up. Okay, but you got to come on Thursday to hang out for all of the locks. But coming up on the other side, we're going to send you out with one player in the Big Ten that you should keep your eye on, maybe set for a big performance. We'll let you know next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, we love to send you out with one player to keep your eye on in the coming weekend. Tom Fornelli, who are you going with?
I'm going to Iowa and that explosive Hawkeyes offense that put up 40 points last week. They're taking on Iowa State in the Cy-Hawk game, the classic rivalry. And I'm looking for one of the players who was one of the bigger surprises in last week's game. That's right. I'm going to freshman wide receiver Reese Vanderzee. Vanderzee rules. He caught 5 passes for 66 yards and 2 touchdowns last week, which might not seem like a lot for most wide receivers, but for Iowa, I didn't check with the research department, but I'm pretty sure that's the most impressive stat line by an Iowa wide receiver since 1922.
Was that a Vanderpump Rules reference? I love it. My wife will actually watch this show for once and get one of our jokes. All right. I'm going to go with Colston Loveland. If Michigan has any shot of winning this game, I don't have any faith in their receiver scaring Texas. Loveland has to just go full beast mode. Like, he has to have a game that makes scouts say, oh, that guy could be our first rounder. He's their best receiver. He needs to just be the best player on the field for Michigan.
I am going to piggyback off Tom Fornelli. I'm looking at the Iowa Hawkeyes and Cade McNamara, their QB, the Tim Lester era. A little bit of a bumpy start, right? Couple of field goals. You're like, oh no, here we go again. But offensive fireworks in the second half. He finished with 3 touchdowns, and I love what I saw out of Vanderzee. 6'4", 205 pounds, long, lean target. He clearly has a guy on the outside now. I want to see if he can do it against a little bit bigger of a challenge there in Iowa State.
So we've got Oregon. You know, they want to get things moving. They've fallen in the AP poll. But Dylan Gabriel, as we discussed on the Cover 3 podcast, still had a very productive day, even if the Ducks only put 24 points on the scoreboard. So let's go back to what happened with Boise State last week, because that Boise State defense was carved up by my guy, J.C. French. And parlez-vous en français is going to be Dylan Gabriel with a lot of touchdowns, because I think that Gabriel is going to have a massive day against this Boise State defense. And so give me Dylan Gabriel to not only get all those yards, but to also get a whole bunch of touchdowns as well in that primetime showdown. Well, if you liked what you got here, we bring it all the time. I mean, we're talking Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, Saturday on youtube.com/cover3 or wherever you get your podcasts. Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern time if you want to come hang out for more big game breakdown. Thursdays, 11 a.m. Eastern time to come get your locks. And of course, on Saturday nights, come join us in the Cover 3 tailgate, 11:30 p.m. Eastern time. It's when we start recapping the day, where we will recap what has been a massive Saturday in all of college football. For Danny Cannell and Bud Elliott and Tom Fornelli, I'm Chip Patterson. Gentlemen, thank you very much.